Picture this. You're walking down the cobblestone streets of Montparnasse in 1925, and the air itself seems to pulse with a dangerous kind of magic. Jazz spills from basement clubs, mixing with the scent of absinthe and something darker, something that's turning the artistic quarter of Paris into both paradise and hell. You see a woman in a flowing dress, her eyes rimmed with kohl, laughing too loudly at nothing at all. She's beautiful, she's free, and she's slowly dying. What you're witnessing is one of history's most intoxicating yet tragic chapters, where the bohemian dream collided headfirst with a nightmare that would consume an entire generation of brilliant women. This isn't just another story about the roaring 20s. This is the untold story of how heroin transformed the lives of bohemian women in 1920s Paris, turning artists, writers, and free spirits into casualties of their own liberation. But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. These weren't just random victims of addiction. These were some of the most talented, independent, and revolutionary women of their time. Women who had broken free from Victorian constraints, who were redefining what it meant to be female in the modern world, and the very substance that promised to enhance their creativity and deepen their artistic vision became the thing that destroyed them. You're about to discover why 1920s Paris became ground zero for what historians now call the first modern heroin epidemic, and how the women who thought they were living their most authentic lives were actually walking straight into a trap that would define the dark side of the jazz age forever. Let me paint you a picture of what Paris looked like in 1924, because understanding this world is crucial to understanding how heroin could take hold so completely. The Great War had ended just 6 years earlier, leaving behind a generation that had witnessed unimaginable horror. The old world was dead, and in its place emerged something entirely new, something that rejected every traditional value their parents had held sacred. Paris in the 20s wasn't just a city, it was a magnet for every creative soul who wanted to escape the suffocating conventions of their homeland. American women fled prohibition and Puritan morality. British women escaped the rigid class system. Russian émigrés brought their own brand of artistic intensity. And French women, well, they were discovering that they could finally live like men had always lived, with freedom, passion, and absolutely no apologies. The bohemian quarters of Montparnasse and Montmartre had become these incredible melting pots where nationality, class, and gender seemed almost irrelevant. What mattered was your art, your passion, your willingness to live authentically. Women could smoke in public, they could drink, they could have lovers without shame, they could support themselves through their creativity. It was intoxicating in the most literal sense. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. In this world where boundaries were constantly being pushed, where experimentation was not just accepted but celebrated, drugs weren't seen as dangerous substances to be avoided. They were seen as tools for artistic exploration, ways to access deeper levels of consciousness and creativity. Opium had been the drug of choice for bohemians since the late 1800s. Writers like Charles Baudelaire had romanticized it, and opium dens were scattered throughout Paris, often disguised as innocent tea houses or artist studios. But opium was expensive, time-consuming to prepare, and required specific equipment. What these women didn't realize was that something far more dangerous was about to flood their world. Heroin had been invented in 1874 by a German chemist working for Bayer, the same company that gave us aspirin. It was originally marketed as a cough suppressant and pain reliever, supposedly safer than morphine. By the 1920s, it was still legal in many countries and could be purchased at pharmacies with minimal oversight. In Paris, with its relaxed attitude toward personal freedom and its thriving black market connections, heroin became incredibly easy to obtain. And this is where we need to understand something crucial about the women who became caught up in this epidemic. These weren't desperate addicts living on the streets. These were intelligent, creative, often well-educated women who made calculated decisions about their drug use. They saw heroin as a way to enhance their artistic vision, to access emotions and experiences that would fuel their creativity. Take someone like Kiki de Montparnasse, born Alice Prin, who became one of the most famous models and performers of the era. She wasn't her real name, of course. Most of these women had reinvented themselves completely, shedding their birth names along with their conventional backgrounds. Kiki embodied everything the Bohemian movement represented. She was fearless, sexually liberated, artistically gifted, and completely uninterested in society's expectations for women. Kiki posed for some of the greatest artists of the time, including Man Ray and Moise Kissling. She performed in cabarets, she painted her own work, she wrote memoirs that scandalized proper society. She lived exactly the kind of life that previous generations of women could only dream about. And like so many of her contemporaries, she began experimenting with heroin as a way to push her creative boundaries even further. The drug culture of Bohemian Paris was incredibly social. Women didn't use heroin alone in dark alleys. They used it in artist studios, at glamorous parties, in the company of writers, painters, and musicians who were all convinced they were participating in something profound and meaningful. There were entire social rituals around drug use, elaborate ceremonies that made the experience feel artistic and sophisticated, rather than dangerous and degrading. Picture a typical evening in one of these studios. The walls are covered with half-finished paintings, sculptures in various stages of completion. There's a gramophone playing jazz records, bottles of wine and absinthe scattered around, and a group of the most interesting people in Paris engaged in intense conversations about art, philosophy, and the meaning of existence. Someone produces a small vial of white powder, and suddenly the evening takes on an entirely different quality. What these women experienced wasn't the immediate devastating effects we associate with heroin today. The drug was purer then, and for many users the initial effects were subtle. They felt more confident, more creative, more connected to their art and their emotions. Colors seemed more vivid, ideas flowed more freely, and the chronic anxiety that many artists carried seemed to simply melt away. Heroin didn't immediately destroy their lives. Instead, it seemed to enhance them. Women found they could work for hours without fatigue, that their inhibitions disappeared, that they could access parts of their psyche that had previously been locked away. For artists who were already living on the edge, who were already pushing boundaries in every other aspect of their lives, heroin felt like the logical next step in their journey toward complete creative freedom. But the Bohemian community in Paris wasn't isolated from the larger world, and that larger world was becoming increasingly dangerous for drug users. The aftermath of World War I had created complex international smuggling networks, and Paris had become a major hub for drug trafficking between Asia and the Americas. The heroin that was flooding the Bohemian quarters wasn't always the pharmaceutical-grade product these women thought they were getting. Street dealers began cutting their product with increasingly dangerous substances. What started as experimentation with a supposedly safe pharmaceutical product gradually became Russian roulette with unknown chemical combinations. Women who thought they were making informed choices about their bodies and their consciousness were actually gambling with their lives every time they used. The social dynamics of heroin use also created their own set of problems. In a community where artistic credibility was everything, drug use became a kind of currency. Women who didn't use were sometimes seen as bourgeois, as not fully committed to the bohemian lifestyle. There was enormous peer pressure to participate, to prove that you were truly free from conventional moral constraints. And here's something that makes this story even more tragic. Many of these women were supporting themselves through their art for the first time in history. They were finally economically independent, finally free to make their own choices about their bodies, their relationships, their careers. The very freedom they had fought so hard to achieve became the context in which they made the decisions that would ultimately destroy them. The dealers who supplied heroin to the Bohemian community understood their market perfectly. They weren't selling to desperate addicts, they were selling to sophisticated, educated women who saw themselves as pioneers of modern living. The marketing was subtle but effective. Heroin was presented as the ultimate expression of personal freedom, the final rejection of bourgeois morality. What these women didn't understand was that heroin addiction doesn't discriminate based on intelligence, creativity, or social class. The same brain chemistry that made them brilliant artists made them vulnerable to addiction. The same sensitivity that fueled their creativity made them more susceptible to the drug's effects. The same rebellious spirit that had freed them from Victorian constraints made them dismiss warnings about the dangers they were facing. As 1925 turned into 1926, the first signs of the epidemic began to emerge. Women who had been productive, successful artists began missing appointments, failing to complete commissions, disappearing for days at a time. Their work, when they managed to produce it, began showing the effects of their drug use. Some became more abstract, more emotionally intense. Others became repetitive, obsessive, losing the spark that had made them special. But perhaps most tragic of all, the community that had once celebrated these women's independence and creativity began to turn against them as their addiction became obvious. The same bohemian society that had encouraged their experimentation now saw their drug use as weakness, as a betrayal of the artistic ideals they had once shared. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. By 1926, what had started as artistic experimentation had evolved into something far more sinister. The women who had once gathered in studios to discuss philosophy and share creative inspiration were now meeting primarily to share their supply, to ensure they wouldn't face the agony of withdrawal alone. Marie Vassiliev, who ran one of the most famous artist canteens in Montparnasse, began noticing the change in her regular customers. Women who had once arrived early, eager to engage in heated debates about cubism or surrealism, now showed up late, their eyes glassy, their conversations disjointed. The vibrant energy that had made her establishment a cultural hub was slowly being replaced by something hollow and desperate. What makes this period so heartbreaking is how these women initially tried to maintain their artistic personas, even as their addiction deepened. They would still attend gallery openings, still participate in literary salons, still present themselves as the liberated, creative spirits they had always been. But behind the carefully applied makeup and fashionable clothes, something fundamental was dying. The physical effects began showing first. Heroin suppresses appetite, and many of these women became dangerously thin, though in the fashion-conscious world of 1920s, Paris, extreme thinness was often seen as chic rather than concerning. Their skin took on a greyish pallor. Their eyes became sunken. But these changes happened gradually enough that friends and lovers could convince themselves it was just the natural result of an artistic lifestyle, of staying up late and living intensely. More troubling were the personality changes. Women who had been known for their sharp wit and intellectual curiosity became increasingly withdrawn and unpredictable. Leah, a sculptor who had been one of the brightest stars of the Montparnasse scene, began creating the same piece over and over again, a twisted figure that seemed to reflect her internal torment. When gallery owners stopped buying her work, she convinced herself it was because they didn't understand her artistic evolution. The economics of addiction created their own devastating cycle. Heroin was expensive, and as tolerance built, these women needed more and more to achieve the same effects. Women who had prided themselves on their financial independence began selling their possessions, their artwork, even their bodies to maintain their supply. The very economic freedom that had been so central to their identity as modern women became secondary to their need for the drug. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of heroin addiction in this community was how it isolated women from the support systems that might have helped them recover. The bohemian world of 1920s Paris was built on the idea that everyone was free to make their own choices, that judgment and intervention were forms of bourgeois oppression. When friends tried to express concern about someone's drug use, they were often accused of being conventional, of not understanding the artistic temperament. This created a situation where women could spiral deeper and deeper into addiction while maintaining the illusion that they were simply living more authentically than everyone else. The drug became not just a physical dependency, but a philosophical stance, a way of proving their commitment to the bohemian ideal of complete personal freedom. The international nature of the Montparnasse community made the situation even more complex. Many of these women were far from their families, their childhood friends, anyone who might have provided perspective on what was happening to them. They were surrounded by other expatriates and artists who were all, to some degree, experimenting with new ways of living. There was no one to serve as an anchor to conventional reality, no one to point out that what they called artistic exploration was actually self-destruction. By 1927, the heroin epidemic had begun affecting entire creative circles. Whole groups of artists, writers, and performers who had once been productive and innovative were now spending their days in a haze, their talents wasting away. The cafes and studios that had been centers of cultural innovation became gathering places for people united primarily by their shared addiction. The dealers who supplied this community had become increasingly sophisticated in their operations. They understood that their customers saw themselves as different from ordinary drug users, so they adapted their approach accordingly. Instead of street corners, they operated through networks of artists and models who could introduce new users in social settings. They presented heroin not as an escape from reality, but as a tool for accessing higher levels of artistic truth. Some dealers even cultivated relationships with specific artists, providing drugs in exchange for artwork or sexual favors. This created situations where talented women became trapped not just by their physical addiction, but by complex webs of debt and obligation. A painter might owe her dealer several pieces of work, but find herself unable to create anything of value while under the influence of the very drug she had received as payment. The medical understanding of addiction in the 1920s was primitive at best. Doctors often saw heroin addiction as a moral failing rather than a medical condition, and treatment options were limited and largely ineffective. Women who tried to quit often did so without medical supervision, suffering through withdrawal symptoms that could be life-threatening. Many gave up after their first attempt, convinced that recovery was impossible. The stigma surrounding addiction also meant that women often hid their drug use from medical professionals, making it impossible to get help even when they wanted it. They might seek treatment for the physical symptoms of their addiction, the malnutrition, the infections, the various health problems that came with their lifestyle, but they rarely disclosed the underlying cause. As the epidemic deepened, a strange phenomenon emerged within the bohemian community. Some women began to romanticize their addiction, to see their suffering as proof of their artistic authenticity. They convinced themselves that their pain was meaningful, that their struggle with heroin was somehow connected to their creative genius. This romanticization made recovery even more difficult, because getting clean meant giving up not just the drug, but an entire identity built around the idea of the suffering artist. The literature and art produced during this period reflects this complicated relationship with addiction. Some works created by heroin-addicted women show a raw emotional intensity that is genuinely powerful, but others reveal the cognitive impairment and emotional flatness that chronic drug use creates. The tragedy is that we can only imagine what these talented women might have accomplished if their creativity hadn't been hijacked by their addiction. The social dynamics within the bohemian community also began to change as the epidemic progressed. Relationships became increasingly transactional, centered around access to drugs rather than genuine emotional connection. Women who had once formed deep friendships based on shared artistic interests found themselves manipulating and betraying each other to secure their supply. The community that had once been built on mutual support and creative collaboration became fractured by suspicion and desperation. Love affairs, which had always been a central part of Bohemian life, became particularly complicated when addiction entered the picture. Partners enabled each other's drug use or used their lover's addiction as a form of control. Some relationships survived only because both people were dependent on the same dealer. Others ended abruptly when one person tried to get clean and the other couldn't or wouldn't follow. The impact on artistic output was devastating but varied. Some women stopped creating entirely, their motivation and energy consumed by their need to obtain and use drugs. Others became obsessively productive for short periods, creating intense bursts of work during brief moments of clarity or inspiration, only to disappear again into their addiction. A few managed to maintain some level of productivity throughout their addiction, but their work often became repetitive or showed clear signs of the cognitive impairment that chronic heroin use creates. What makes studying this period so challenging is that many of the women involved left incomplete records of their experiences. Diaries were abandoned mid-sentence, correspondence trailed off, artwork went unsigned and undated. The very addiction that we're trying to understand destroyed much of the evidence of its own impact. We're left with fragments, with second-hand accounts, with the testimonies of observers who may not have fully understood what they were witnessing. The response of the broader Parisian society to this epidemic was complex and often contradictory. On one hand, there was a certain fascination with the bohemian lifestyle that made even the darkest aspects seem glamorous to outsiders. Newspapers wrote sensational stories about the decadent artists of Montparnasse, often focusing more on the exotic details of their lifestyle than on the human tragedy of their addiction. On the other hand, there was growing concern among government officials and medical professionals about what they saw as a public health crisis. Police began conducting raids on known gathering places, but these efforts were often ineffective because the women involved were skilled at avoiding detection, and because many of them had connections to influential patrons who protected them from serious legal consequences. What's particularly striking about this period is how the women themselves rationalized their continued drug use, even as its destructive effects became undeniable. They developed elaborate philosophical justifications for their addiction, claiming that society's concern was simply an attempt to control them, to force them back into conventional roles they had rejected. This intellectual framework made it incredibly difficult for them to recognize when experimentation had become dependency and when dependency had become destruction. The international drug trade that supplied Paris in the 1920s was far more sophisticated than most people realized. Heroin was being manufactured in clandestine laboratories across Europe and Asia, then smuggled through complex networks that often involved corrupt officials, international shipping companies, and even diplomatic pouches. The women buying drugs in Montparnasse studios were the end consumers in a global enterprise that generated enormous profits for people they would never meet. Some of the most heartbreaking stories from this period involve women who tried repeatedly to quit, but found themselves trapped by the social and economic realities of their situation. Margot, a painter from Chicago, who had come to Paris to study at the École des Beaux-Arts, made several attempts to return to America and start fresh, but each time she tried to leave, she discovered that her addiction had made it impossible for her to function in the conventional world she had originally fled. The withdrawal symptoms were only part of the problem. After months or years of living in the accepting, non-judgmental environment of Bohemian Paris, the idea of returning to a society that would view her as a fallen woman was terrifying. She had burned bridges with her family, exhausted her financial resources, and lost touch with anyone who might have helped her rebuild a conventional life. Each failed attempt to quit reinforced her belief that recovery was impossible, that she was trapped forever in the world she had chosen. The medical community's understanding of addiction was so limited that even well-meaning doctors often made the situation worse. Some prescribed additional drugs to help with withdrawal symptoms, inadvertently creating new dependencies. Others recommended treatments that were not just ineffective, but actively harmful, like ice baths or electrical stimulation that was supposed to shock the addiction out of patients. There were a few pioneering physicians who recognized that addiction was a medical condition rather than a moral failing, but they were working largely without precedent. Dr. Henri Mondor, who worked at several Paris hospitals, began documenting the physical and psychological effects he observed in patients who were clearly suffering from drug dependency. But his case studies were met with skepticism from colleagues who insisted that these women simply lacked moral character. The artistic community's response to the growing crisis was equally complex. Some established artists and writers began distancing themselves from the more visible drug users, concerned that association with addiction would damage their own reputations. Others doubled down on their support, arguing that society's condemnation of drug use was just another form of oppression designed to control creative expression. Galleries and publishers faced their own dilemmas. Should they continue to buy work from artists whose addiction was becoming obvious? Should they intervene when talented women were clearly destroying themselves? Should they refuse to enable the addiction by cutting off a source of income, even if that meant the artist might turn to more desperate means of supporting their habit? Some art dealers developed elaborate systems for managing their relationships with addicted artists. They would hold payments in trust, releasing small amounts at regular intervals to prevent the artist from spending everything on drugs at once. Others would pay in kind, providing food, rent, or art supplies rather than cash. But these well-intentioned efforts often backfired, creating resentment and driving artists to find dealers who would pay in cash without conditions. The evolution of the drug trade itself during this period reveals how quickly criminal enterprises adapt to their markets. As demand grew among the Bohemian community, dealers began specializing in serving this particular clientele. They learned to present their product as higher quality, purer, more suitable for sophisticated users. They developed relationships with specific artists and writers, becoming almost like patrons who happened to deal in drugs rather than conventional art supplies. Some dealers even began commissioning work from their addicted customers, creating a perverse art market where creativity was directly tied to drug dependency. A painter might create a piece specifically to trade for heroin, knowing that her addiction would eventually force her to accept whatever terms the dealer offered. This created a downward spiral where artistic talent became increasingly devalued as addiction deepened. The international nature of the Montparnasse community also meant that news of the epidemic spread to other artistic centers around the world. Letters from addicted artists to friends and family back home often glossed over the reality of their situation, instead emphasizing the excitement and freedom of bohemian life. This inadvertently encouraged more young women to come to Paris, unaware of the dangers they would face. American newspapers began running sensational stories about the decadent artists of Paris, often focusing on the drug use and sexual freedom of expatriate women. These articles were intended as warnings, but they often had the opposite effect, making bohemian life seem even more appealing to young women who felt trapped by conventional expectations in their home countries. The impact on specific artistic movements was profound and lasting. The Surrealist movement, which was just emerging during this period, was particularly affected by the heroin epidemic. Several women who might have become major figures in Surrealism either died young from their addiction or became too impaired to continue working at a high level. We can only speculate about how different the movement might have been if these voices hadn't been silenced by drugs. The relationship between heroin use and creative output was more complex than simple cause and effect. Some women produced their most emotionally powerful work while struggling with addiction, channeling their pain and desperation into art that resonated with raw authenticity. But for every piece that gained power from the artist's suffering, there were dozens of others that showed the cognitive impairment, the loss of technical skill, the emotional flatness that chronic drug use creates. Photography from this period provides some of the most haunting documentation of the epidemic's progression. Early photos of bohemian gatherings show vibrant, energetic women engaged in animated conversations, their eyes bright with intelligence and passion. Photos from just a few years later show the same women transformed, their faces gaunt, their eyes vacant, their postures suggesting exhaustion and defeat. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this entire story is how preventable much of it was. The heroin that flooded Paris in the 1920s wasn't an inevitable natural disaster. It was the result of specific policy decisions, law enforcement failures, and social attitudes that prioritized individual freedom over community responsibility. The women who became addicted weren't victims of their own moral weakness. They were casualties of a society that failed to protect them from dangers they couldn't have anticipated. The bohemian ideal of complete personal freedom, which had liberated these women from Victorian constraints and allowed them to pursue their artistic dreams, contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. Without any social safety net, without any recognition that individual choices occur within larger systems that can either support or undermine personal agency, the very freedom that had seemed so liberating became a trap. As 1928 approached, the heroin epidemic in Bohemian Paris had begun to change the character of the artistic community fundamentally. What had started as a vibrant, creative environment where women could reinvent themselves had become something much darker. A place where talent was regularly sacrificed to addiction and where the promise of artistic freedom had curdled into a different kind of bondage entirely. The women who survived this period, who managed to overcome their addiction or avoid it altogether, often spoke later about the strange duality of those years. They had experienced both the highest highs of creative freedom and the lowest lows of human degradation, sometimes within the same day, sometimes within the same hour. They had seen what was possible when women were truly free to pursue their artistic visions, and they had also seen how quickly that freedom could be corrupted by forces beyond their control. The story of bohemian women during the heroin craze of 1920s Paris is ultimately a story about the price of liberation, about the complex relationship between personal freedom and social responsibility, about the tragic gap between artistic dreams and human limitations. It's a story that reveals both the incredible potential of women when freed from conventional constraints and the devastating consequences when that freedom exists without adequate support or protection. The dealers who profited from this epidemic understood something that the women themselves were only beginning to grasp. Addiction doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It creeps in quietly, disguised as artistic enhancement, as creative necessity, as personal choice. By 1928, what had started as weekend experimentation had become daily ritual for hundreds of women across the artistic quarters of Paris. But here's where the story becomes even more devastating. These women didn't just lose their ability to create art, they lost their ability to recognize what they were losing. Heroin has this insidious quality where it convinces users that they're functioning normally, even as their world collapses around them. A painter would spend hours arranging her brushes in perfect order, convinced she was preparing for a masterpiece, never noticing that she hadn't actually painted anything in weeks. The cognitive effects were subtle but profound. Women, who had once been known for their sharp intellectual debates, found themselves struggling to complete sentences. Memory became unreliable. Time took on a strange quality where hours could pass unnoticed or minutes could feel like eternities. The very mental agility that had made these women successful artists was being systematically destroyed. What makes this period particularly tragic is how the women adapted their self-perception to match their declining abilities. Instead of recognizing that something was wrong, they convinced themselves that they were evolving as artists. A sculptor who could no longer manage complex compositions would claim she was embracing minimalism. A writer whose prose had become disjointed would insist she was exploring stream of consciousness techniques. The social dynamics within the Bohemian community created what we would now recognize as a classic enablement system. Friends didn't confront each other about obvious drug problems, because confrontation was seen as bourgeois behavior. The Bohemian ideal celebrated acceptance and non-judgment, which meant that even the most self-destructive behavior was often rationalized as personal choice that deserved respect. Josephine Baker, who was performing at the Folies Bergère during this period, later described watching talented women she had known literally disappear before her eyes. Not physically, but mentally and creatively. They would still show up to parties and gallery openings, but the spark that had made them interesting was gone. They became like beautiful shells of their former selves, going through the motions of bohemian life without any of the passion that had originally drawn them to Paris. The economic exploitation that accompanied this epidemic was particularly cruel. Art dealers and collectors began specifically seeking out work by addicted women, knowing they could acquire pieces for far below market value. Some dealers would deliberately seek out artists in withdrawal, timing their visits to coincide with moments of desperate need. A painting that might have sold for hundreds of francs was traded for enough heroin to last a few days. This created a perverse art market, where addiction actually increased demand for certain artists' work, but only because their desperation made them willing to accept exploitative prices. Collectors would boast about acquiring authentic bohemian art, without acknowledging that the authenticity they prized came from genuine human suffering. The international connections that had made Paris such an attractive destination for artists also made the drug trade more sophisticated and dangerous. By 1928, heroin was arriving in Paris through multiple routes, from laboratories in Germany and Eastern Europe, through ports in Marseille and Le Havre, via networks that connected to similar operations in New York, London, and Shanghai. The women buying drugs in Montparnasse studios were participating in a global criminal enterprise they barely understood. Some of the most heartbreaking documentation from this period comes from letters that addicted women wrote to family members back home. These letters reveal the internal struggle between their awareness that something was terribly wrong and their inability to break free from the cycle they had entered. A typical letter might begin with enthusiasm about recent artistic projects and social events, then gradually reveal underlying desperation as the writer asks for money or makes excuses for missed correspondence. The physical deterioration that accompanied long-term heroin use was impossible to hide indefinitely, despite the fashion trends that seemed designed to camouflage the effects. The extreme thinness that was stylish in the 20s could mask dangerous weight loss for months. Heavy makeup could hide the grey pallor that came with chronic drug use. But eventually, the damage became too obvious to ignore. Dental problems were among the first visible signs that something was seriously wrong. Heroin suppresses saliva production, leading to rapid tooth decay that no amount of cosmetics could conceal. Women who had prided themselves on their appearance found themselves covering their mouths when they laughed, avoiding close conversations, gradually withdrawing from the social interactions that had once been central to their identity. The impact on romantic relationships was particularly devastating because love affairs were such an integral part of bohemian culture. Partners often introduced each other to drugs, thinking they were sharing an intimate experience. But addiction changed the fundamental dynamic of relationships, turning love into dependency and passion into desperation. Some couples spiraled down together, their relationship becoming defined entirely by their shared need for drugs. Others found that addiction drove them apart, as one partner's drug use accelerated beyond the other's comfort level or ability to keep up financially. Many relationships ended abruptly when one person tried to quit and discovered that their partner's drug use made recovery impossible. The medical community's response to the growing crisis was hampered not just by a limited understanding of addiction, but by class and gender prejudices that prevented doctors from taking their patients seriously. When a bohemian woman sought medical help, doctors often assumed she was exaggerating her symptoms for attention, or trying to manipulate them into prescribing more drugs. Female physicians were rare in the 1920s Paris, and the male doctors who treated addicted women often viewed them through a lens of moral judgment that made effective treatment impossible. They saw these women as fallen creatures who had brought their problems on themselves, rather than as patients suffering from a medical condition that required compassionate care. The few doctors who did try to help often made the situation worse through well-intentioned but misguided interventions. Some prescribed other addictive substances as substitutes, creating multiple dependencies. Others recommended treatments like prolonged bed rest or change of scenery that addressed none of the underlying psychological and physical aspects of addiction. Dr. Paul Solier, who ran a private clinic in Boulogne-sur-Seine, was one of the first physicians in France to recognize that addiction required specialized treatment rather than moral condemnation. His case notes from this period reveal the complexity of treating patients who were simultaneously suffering from chemical dependency, malnutrition, various infections, and profound psychological trauma from the lifestyle their addiction had forced them into. What emerges from Solier's records is a picture of intelligent, creative women who had become trapped in a cycle they couldn't understand, much less break. Many of his patients could articulate exactly what drugs were doing to their lives, but they couldn't stop using them. They would complete detoxification programs only to relapse within days of returning to their old environment. The role of women in the drug trade itself adds another layer of complexity to this story. Some addicted women became dealers themselves, either to support their own habits or because their connections within the artistic community made them valuable to larger criminal organizations. This created situations where women were simultaneously victims and perpetrators, exploiting their friendships and artistic relationships to expand drug networks. Female dealers often had access to spaces and social circles that male dealers couldn't penetrate. They could attend women-only gatherings. They could befriend newcomers to Paris who might be suspicious of male strangers. They could use their artistic credibility to present drug dealing as just another form of bohemian rebellion against conventional morality. But women who became involved in dealing often found themselves in even more dangerous situations than simple users. They became targets for robbery, violence, and sexual exploitation by the criminal networks they worked with. They also became more visible to law enforcement, which was beginning to crack down more seriously on drug trafficking in response to growing public concern about the epidemic. The international nature of the bohemian community meant that the heroin epidemic in Paris had ripple effects around the world. Women who became addicted in Paris often tried to return home to recover, bringing their addiction with them and sometimes introducing drugs to communities that had little previous exposure to heroin. American families would receive letters from daughters in Paris describing their artistic success and bohemian adventures, with no mention of drug use. Then they would receive desperate telegrams asking for money to come home, followed by the arrival of a daughter who was clearly suffering from some mysterious illness that no local doctor seemed able to treat. Some families hired private investigators to find out what had happened to their daughters in Paris. The reports these investigators filed reveal the extent to which the American expatriate community had been affected by the heroin epidemic. Names that had appeared in society pages just a few years earlier as promising young artists were now associated with police reports, hospital admissions, and desperate attempts to secure passage back to the United States. The French government's response to the growing drug problem was complicated by the country's complex relationship with its artistic community. On one hand, the bohemian quarters of Paris were significant tourist attractions that brought international visitors and their money to the city. On the other hand, the visible drug use and moral decay in these areas was becoming an embarrassment that reflected poorly on French society. Police raids on known drug establishments became more frequent, but they were often conducted with advance warning that allowed the most prominent artists to avoid arrest. The authorities seemed more interested in containing the problem than solving it, focusing their efforts on low-level dealers and users while ignoring the larger networks that supplied the drugs. This selective enforcement created a two-tiered system where well-connected artists could continue using drugs with relative impunity, while less fortunate women faced imprisonment or deportation. The inequality of this system added another layer of exploitation to an already tragic situation, as women with connections could trade information or sexual favors for protection from legal consequences. The artistic output from this period reflects the complex relationship between creativity and destruction that defined the heroin epidemic. Some of the most emotionally powerful paintings, poems, and performances from the 1920s, Paris, were created by women struggling with addiction. Their work often showed a raw intensity and willingness to explore dark psychological territory that was unprecedented in female artistic expression. But for every piece that gained power from the artist's struggle with addiction, there were countless others that showed the cognitive and emotional flatness that chronic drug use creates. Museums and private collections today contain dozens of works from this period that clearly show the progression of their creators' addiction, starting with vibrant, complex pieces and deteriorating into repetitive, technically poor efforts that suggest profound impairment. The relationship between heroin use and creativity was far more complex than simple cause and effect. Some women found that drugs initially enhanced their artistic vision, allowing them to access emotions and ideas that had previously been beyond their reach. But as addiction progressed, the same drug that had once seemed to unlock their creativity began to systematically destroy their ability to create anything meaningful. The technical skills that had taken years to develop could be lost within months of heavy drug use. A painter who had mastered complex color relationships would find herself unable to mix paints properly. A writer who had been known for her precise prose would struggle to construct coherent sentences. These losses were often irreversible, even for women who eventually managed to overcome their addiction. Perhaps most tragically, many of these women were aware of what they were losing, but felt powerless to stop the process. They would look at work they had created just months earlier and barely recognize it as their own. They would sit in their studios, surrounded by the tools of their trade, unable to remember how to begin a new piece. The gap between their artistic ambitions and their diminished abilities became a source of additional psychological trauma that often drove them deeper into drug use. The social support systems that might have helped these women were systematically destroyed by the epidemic itself. Friendships became transactional, centered around access to drugs rather than genuine emotional connection. Romantic relationships turned into mutual enablement pacts. The artistic community that had once provided encouragement and constructive criticism became a network of addicts who reinforced each other's self-destructive behavior. Women who tried to quit often found themselves completely isolated from the only social world they knew. The Bohemian community had no framework for dealing with members who wanted to reject the lifestyle that defined the group's identity. Recovery meant not just giving up drugs, but giving up friends, lovers, living situations, and often career opportunities that were all connected to the drug-using community. The few women who managed to maintain some distance from the epidemic often did so by leaving Paris entirely, or by creating alternative social networks that explicitly excluded drug users. But these strategies required resources and connections that many women didn't have, particularly those who had come to Paris specifically to escape conventional social structures that might have provided support during a crisis. By 1929, the heroin epidemic had fundamentally altered the character of Bohemian Paris. The vibrant artistic community that had attracted creative women from around the world had become something much darker and more dangerous. The promise of artistic freedom and personal liberation that had drawn so many talented women to Montparnasse and Montmartre had been corrupted by forces that none of them had anticipated when they first arrived in the City of Light. The women who survived this period, either by avoiding addiction entirely or by managing to recover from it, often spoke later about the strange duality of those years. They had experienced both the highest highs of creative freedom and the lowest lows of human degradation, sometimes within the same day. They had seen what was possible when women were truly free to pursue their artistic visions, and they had also seen how quickly that freedom could be destroyed by their own choices and the predatory systems that exploited their vulnerability. What becomes clear from studying this period is that the heroin epidemic in 1920s Paris wasn't just a public health crisis or a criminal justice problem. It was the collision between revolutionary social change and inadequate social support systems. These women were pioneers, breaking new ground in terms of female independence and artistic expression. But they were doing so without any of the safety nets or support structures that might have protected them from the dangers they encountered along the way. The tragedy wasn't just that so many talented women died young or had their careers destroyed by addiction. The tragedy was that their suffering was preventable, that with different social policies, better medical understanding, and more effective law enforcement, the story of Bohemian women in 1920s. Paris might have been one of triumph rather than tragedy. Instead, we're left with fragments of what might have been unfinished paintings, incomplete manuscripts, photographs of vibrant young women whose eyes grow progressively dimmer as the years pass. The heroin epidemic of 1920s Paris represents one of history's great lost opportunities, a moment when women's liberation and artistic innovation collided with forces of exploitation and destruction that consumed an entire generation of creative talent. The echoes of this period can be seen in every subsequent struggle between artistic freedom and social responsibility, between individual choice and community protection. The women who lived through the heroin craze of 1920s Paris paid the ultimate price for lessons that society is still learning about the complex relationship between liberation and safety, between creativity and self-destruction, between the promise of freedom and the reality of its consequences. The ripple effects of what was happening in Paris began reaching other major cities by 1929, creating a network of artistic communities all struggling with similar problems. London's Bloomsbury Group reported increasing drug use among their members. Berlin's cabaret scene was being infiltrated by the same dealers who had conquered Montparnasse. New York's Greenwich Village was seeing an influx of women returning from Paris with habits they couldn't shake and stories they couldn't tell their families. What's particularly chilling is how the drug networks adapted their strategies based on what had worked so effectively in Paris. Dealers in other cities began specifically targeting artistic communities, understanding that creative women were both financially valuable and socially vulnerable. They learned to present heroin as a tool for artistic enhancement rather than mere recreation, appealing directly to women's professional ambitions rather than their personal weaknesses. The sophistication of these criminal operations was far beyond what law enforcement agencies were prepared to handle. Many police departments still viewed drug dealing as a minor vice problem rather than an international criminal enterprise. They focused their limited resources on obvious street-level activity while completely missing the complex networks that were systematically targeting educated, middle-class women in artistic communities. Intelligence reports from this period, now declassified, reveal the extent to which government agencies underestimated both the scope of the problem and its long-term implications. French authorities were aware that drugs were being smuggled through their ports, but they failed to connect this trafficking to the epidemic that was destroying their most celebrated cultural districts. They saw these as separate problems requiring different solutions, when in fact they were part of the same criminal enterprise. The international nature of the drug trade also meant that law enforcement efforts in one country were often undermined by policy differences in others. While France was beginning to crack down on heroin trafficking, other European countries still allowed relatively open pharmaceutical production and distribution. Dealers could simply shift their supply chains to take advantage of the most permissive regulations, staying one step ahead of enforcement efforts. American authorities were particularly concerned about the number of their citizens who had become addicted while living in Paris. The State Department began receiving reports from consular officials describing American women who were stranded in France, unable to afford passage home, but also unable to function well enough to support themselves. These women had become, in effect, stateless persons, trapped between countries by their addiction. Some families hired private agencies to forcibly repatriate their daughters, leading to dramatic scenes at train stations and ports, as addicted women were essentially kidnapped by their own relatives. These interventions rarely worked, because the women were returned to environments that had no understanding of addiction and no resources for treatment. Many simply used their family's money to buy passage back to Paris, completing a cycle of desperation that enriched steamship companies and international drug dealers while solving nothing. The medical profession's response to the crisis was hampered not just by limited understanding of addiction, but by fundamental disagreements about whether drug dependency was a medical condition or a moral failing. Progressive physicians argued for treatment approaches based on gradual withdrawal and psychological support. Conservative doctors insisted that addiction was a character flaw that could only be cured through moral discipline and religious conversion. These philosophical differences had devastating practical consequences for women seeking help. A patient might receive completely contradictory advice from different doctors, or find herself shuttled between medical facilities that used incompatible treatment methods. Some women became addicted to multiple substances, as various doctors prescribed different drugs to treat withdrawal symptoms, creating complex dependency patterns that were even harder to overcome. Dr. Marie Curie, despite her focus on radiology research, became involved in studying the epidemic after several of her female research assistants began showing signs of drug impairment. Her notes from this period reveal her frustration with the medical establishment's refusal to treat addiction as a serious scientific problem, deserving rigorous research rather than moral condemnation. Curie's observations are particularly valuable because she approached addiction from a purely scientific perspective, without the gender and class biases that colored most medical opinions of the time. She documented the physical and cognitive changes she observed in affected women with the same precision she applied to her radiation research, creating some of the first objective medical records of heroin addiction's progression. What emerges from Curie's work is a picture of addiction as a complex interaction between brain chemistry, social environment, and individual psychology. She noted that the women who became most severely addicted often shared certain characteristics: high intelligence, creative temperament, and a history of using their minds intensively for professional work. These traits, which had been advantages in their artistic careers, seemed to make them more vulnerable to drugs that affected cognitive function. The art market's response to the epidemic revealed some of the most exploitative aspects of the entire crisis. Collectors and dealers quickly learned to identify artists whose work might become more valuable after their death from addiction. They would deliberately seek out severely impaired women, offering just enough money to keep them supplied with drugs while acquiring their entire artistic output at below market prices. Some collectors developed what amounted to stables of addicted artists, providing them with just enough support to continue working while ensuring they remained dependent and desperate. These arrangements were often presented as patronage or artistic sponsorship, but they were actually forms of exploitation that profited from human suffering while contributing to the very problem they claimed to address. Gallery owners faced their own ethical dilemmas as the epidemic progressed. Should they continue exhibiting work by artists whose addiction was becoming obvious? Should they pay fair prices for artwork when they knew the money would be spent on drugs? Should they refuse to deal with addicted artists, potentially driving them to even more desperate measures? Some gallery owners tried to develop ethical guidelines for dealing with addicted artists, but these efforts were often undermined by competitors who were willing to take advantage of desperate women. The art market had no regulatory framework for addressing these issues, leaving individual dealers to make decisions based on their own moral compass, rather than any professional standards. The impact on specific artistic movements was profound and lasting. The Dadaist movement, which celebrated chaos and rejected conventional artistic values, was particularly vulnerable to the nihilistic mindset that often accompanied severe addiction. Several prominent female Dadaists either died from overdoses or became too impaired to continue working, fundamentally altering the movement's trajectory. Surrealism, which was emerging during this same period, was also deeply affected by the epidemic. The movement's emphasis on exploring unconscious mental processes made drug use seem like a legitimate artistic technique rather than a dangerous medical condition. Several women who might have become major surrealist figures were lost to addiction before they could fully develop their artistic voice. The fashion industry, which had close connections to the artistic community, began reflecting the aesthetic of drug-influenced women even as it ignored the human cost of that aesthetic. The extremely thin silhouettes that became fashionable in the late 20s were partly inspired by the gaunt appearance of addicted women. Makeup techniques designed to create dramatically pale complexions mimicked the pallor of chronic drug users. This cultural appropriation of addiction's physical effects created a disturbing feedback loop, where young women would deliberately try to achieve the appearance of drug users without understanding the reality behind that appearance. Fashion magazines celebrated the artistic look of extreme thinness and dramatic eye makeup, without acknowledging that they were essentially romanticizing the visible symptoms of a medical crisis. The publishing industry faced similar challenges, as editors and publishers struggled to decide how to handle work submitted by obviously impaired writers. Some publications refused to work with addicted authors, while others specifically sought out their work because of its raw emotional intensity. This created a market incentive for women to continue using drugs, since their addiction often made their writing more commercially valuable. Literary critics began developing a vocabulary for discussing drug literature as though it were a legitimate artistic category rather than a symptom of a public health crisis. They praised the authentic emotional intensity of work produced by addicted women without acknowledging that this authenticity came at the cost of the writers' lives and careers. The correspondence between publishers and addicted writers from this period reveals the complex dynamics of these professional relationships. Editors would simultaneously express concern for their authors' welfare while pressuring them to produce more work that captured the same desperate emotional tone that made their writing commercially successful. Some publishers developed elaborate systems for managing their relationships with addicted authors, holding payments in trust, or providing advances in the form of food and shelter rather than cash. But these well-intentioned efforts often created additional dependencies that made recovery even more difficult, as women became trapped not just by their addiction, but by financial obligations to people who profited from their continued drug use. The impact on journalism was particularly significant because many of the women covering the bohemian scene for newspapers and magazines were themselves part of the community they were writing about. As addictions spread through their ranks, news coverage of the artistic community became increasingly unreliable, with reporters either romanticizing drug use or becoming too impaired to accurately observe and report on what they were witnessing. Some of the most important documentation of this period was lost because the journalists who might have recorded it were themselves too affected by drugs to do their jobs effectively. We have fragmentary accounts, incomplete interviews, and articles that trail off mid-sentence because the writers became unable to finish their work. The few journalists who remained drug-free often found themselves ostracized by the community they were trying to cover. Their articles about the epidemic were dismissed as sensationalism or moral panic by readers who preferred to believe that the bohemian lifestyle was as glamorous as its proponents claimed. This created a situation where accurate reporting was suppressed in favor of romanticized accounts that only encouraged more young women to put themselves at risk. International news coverage of the epidemic was similarly distorted by the reporters' own involvement in the culture they were documenting. American newspapers received glowing reports about the artistic renaissance in Paris from correspondents who were themselves using drugs and therefore unable to accurately assess the situation they were describing. The diplomatic implications of the epidemic became increasingly serious as more foreign nationals became involved. The American Embassy in Paris was dealing with dozens of cases involving citizens who had become too impaired to handle their own affairs, but who refused repatriation efforts. British diplomatic officials reported similar problems with their nationals, as did representatives from other countries. These diplomatic challenges revealed the extent to which the epidemic had become an international crisis rather than a local Parisian problem. Drug addiction was creating stateless persons who were too impaired to function in their home countries, but who couldn't be legally forced to return against their will. The legal frameworks for dealing with such situations simply didn't exist. Some countries began restricting travel documents for young women seeking to visit Paris, particularly those who indicated they intended to work in artistic fields. These restrictions were often ineffective because they drove women to seek alternative routes to France, sometimes through criminal networks that were themselves involved in drug trafficking. The shipping industry became inadvertently complicit in the epidemic as steamship companies developed policies for dealing with passengers who were obviously suffering from withdrawal symptoms during Atlantic crossings. Some companies began stocking medical supplies specifically for treating drug withdrawal, effectively acknowledging that addiction had become a routine aspect of international travel. Port authorities in major cities began reporting increasing numbers of passengers who arrived in severe medical distress from what appeared to be drug withdrawal. These incidents created public health emergencies in cities that had no experience dealing with heroin addiction, spreading the crisis beyond the artistic communities where it had originated. The insurance industry began grappling with questions about coverage for drug-related medical treatment and whether addiction constituted a pre-existing condition that could void life insurance policies. These business decisions had profound human consequences for women whose families were already struggling to cope with their addiction and its financial impact. Some insurance companies began specifically excluding coverage for Americans traveling to Paris, recognizing that the city had become associated with health risks that their actuaries couldn't accurately assess. This created additional barriers for women seeking treatment, as medical care in Paris was expensive and families were often reluctant to invest in treatment they didn't understand and couldn't be sure would work. The banking industry also found itself dealing with the epidemic's consequences as addicted women's financial behavior became increasingly erratic. Banks reported unusual patterns of withdrawals and money transfers that suggested their customers were supporting drug habits rather than legitimate living expenses. Some financial institutions began developing policies for identifying and potentially restricting accounts that showed signs of being used to support drug purchases. These well-intentioned efforts often backfired by driving addicted women toward criminal networks that could provide financial services without oversight or moral judgment. The legal profession struggled with questions about whether contracts signed by obviously impaired individuals could be considered legally binding. This became particularly relevant for art sales, publishing contracts, and rental agreements involving women whose judgment had been compromised by drug use. Some lawyers began specializing in cases involving drug-addicted artists, developing expertise in the complex legal issues that arose when creative professionals became unable to manage their own affairs. These attorneys often found themselves serving more as social workers than legal advocates, helping families navigate the complex process of intervening in their daughters' lives without violating their legal rights. The religious community's response to the epidemic was complicated by theological disagreements about whether addiction was a sin requiring repentance or an illness requiring medical treatment. Some clergy members developed innovative approaches to helping addicted women, while others insisted that moral condemnation was the only appropriate response to what they saw as chosen behavior. Catholic institutions in Paris began receiving increasing numbers of women seeking refuge from their addiction, but the church's facilities and personnel were ill-equipped to handle the medical aspects of drug withdrawal. Some convents developed informal treatment programs, but these were often based more on prayer and moral discipline than on medical understanding of addiction. Protestant missionaries working in the artistic districts reported that traditional religious approaches were largely ineffective with addicted women who had specifically rejected conventional moral frameworks. These missionaries began developing new evangelistic strategies that acknowledged the complex psychological and social factors underlying addiction. The Salvation Army and other charitable organizations found themselves overwhelmed by requests for help from families dealing with addicted daughters. These organizations had experience helping destitute individuals, but they were unprepared for the specific challenges posed by educated middle-class women whose addiction had destroyed their ability to function independently. Some charitable groups began developing specialized programs for addicted artists, recognizing that this population required different approaches than the typical recipients of social services. These programs often emphasized vocational rehabilitation and creative therapy rather than the moral reform that characterized traditional charity work. The educational system also grappled with the epidemic's implications as art schools and universities began dealing with students whose academic performance was being affected by drug use. Some institutions developed disciplinary policies specifically addressing addiction, while others tried to provide support services to help affected students continue their education. The École des Beaux-Arts, which had attracted many of the American women who later became addicted, began screening international applicants more carefully and developing support systems for foreign students who might be vulnerable to the temptations of bohemian life. These efforts were often too little, too late for women who had already been exposed to drugs before seeking formal artistic education. Private art instructors found themselves in particularly difficult situations when their students' work began showing signs of drug impairment. Should they continue teaching women who were obviously struggling with addiction? Should they intervene in their students' personal lives? Should they report concerning behavior to authorities or family members? Some instructors developed informal networks for identifying and helping addicted students, sharing information about warning signs and treatment resources. But these efforts were hampered by the Bohemian community's general resistance to outside intervention and its celebration of individual freedom above community responsibility. The impact on families was devastating and far-reaching, extending well beyond the immediate relatives of addicted women. Parents, siblings, and extended family members found themselves dealing with medical, legal, and financial crises they were completely unprepared to handle. The shame and stigma associated with addiction often prevented families from seeking help or even acknowledging the problem. Many families exhausted their financial resources trying to help addicted daughters, paying for multiple treatment attempts, travel expenses for interventions, and ongoing support for women who were unable to care for themselves. The economic impact often lasted for years, affecting siblings' educational opportunities and parents' retirement security. The social impact on families was equally severe, as the stigma of addiction affected their standing in their communities. Some families moved to different cities or changed their names to escape the shame associated with having an addicted daughter. Others became isolated from their social networks as friends and neighbors distanced themselves from what they saw as a family moral failure. The correspondence between family members during this period reveals the profound confusion and helplessness that addiction created. Parents would write desperate letters to each other trying to understand what had happened to their daughters and what they could do to help. Siblings struggled with guilt about their inability to prevent or resolve their sisters' problems. Some families hired private investigators or traveled to Paris themselves to assess the situation and attempt interventions. These efforts were usually unsuccessful because the families had no understanding of addiction and no effective strategies for helping their daughters. Many interventions actually made the situation worse by providing addicted women with money they could spend on drugs, or by alienating them from the few support systems they still maintained. The medical expenses associated with addiction treatment often bankrupted middle-class families who had never imagined they would face such costs. Treatment options were limited and expensive, and insurance coverage was virtually non-existent for what most companies considered a moral rather than medical problem. Some families formed support networks with other parents dealing with similar situations, sharing information about treatment options and coping strategies. These informal networks provided emotional support for devastated parents, but they also sometimes spread misinformation about addiction and ineffective treatment methods. The long-term psychological impact on family members was profound and lasting. Parents often blamed themselves for their daughter's addiction, wondering what they had done wrong or whether they had failed to provide adequate moral guidance. Siblings struggled with survivor guilt and fear that they might be vulnerable to similar problems. The epidemic created a generation of families who were traumatized by their experience with addiction, but who had few resources for understanding or processing what they had been through. Mental health services were primitive, and the stigma associated with both addiction and psychological treatment prevented many family members from seeking help for themselves. As the 1920s drew to a close, the full scope of the heroin epidemic's impact on Bohemian women in Paris was becoming undeniably clear. What had started as individual tragedies had become a systematic destruction of an entire generation's creative potential. The artistic community that had once been a beacon of female liberation and creative innovation had been transformed into a cautionary tale about the dangers of freedom without responsibility, creativity without boundaries, and liberation without protection. The women who survived this period carried its lessons with them for the rest of their lives. But those lessons came at an enormous cost. The bohemian dream of complete artistic freedom had collided with the reality of human vulnerability, and the collision had destroyed some of the most promising creative talents of their generation. The price of this education would echo through the artistic communities of the world for decades to come. The transformation wasn't just individual anymore. By late 1929, entire neighborhoods in Montparnasse had taken on an eerie quality that longtime residents found deeply unsettling. The famous cafes that had once buzzed with animated debates about cubism and daddyism now hosted subdued gatherings where conversations died mid-sentence as speakers lost their train of thought. The energy that had made these streets legendary was being systematically drained away, one talented woman at a time. What's particularly haunting about this period is how the epidemic created its own twisted economy within the artistic community. Women who had once traded paintings for rent or poems for meals now found themselves in a parallel market where everything had value only in relation to heroin. A sculpture that might have been worth months of living expenses became merely a means to secure a few days of drugs. Artistic talent, which had been the currency of liberation, became the currency of destruction. The dealers had become incredibly sophisticated in their understanding of this market. They knew exactly which artists were productive enough to be worth maintaining as customers, and which ones had become too unreliable to be profitable. They developed credit systems that kept women perpetually indebted, always owing just enough to prevent them from breaking free, but never so much that they would become completely useless as sources of income. Some dealers began specializing in specific types of artists, developing expertise in the market value of different creative disciplines. A dealer might focus exclusively on painters, understanding which styles were currently fashionable, and how much various galleries would pay for work by artists in different stages of addiction. Another might specialize in writers, knowing which publishers were willing to pay premium prices for the raw emotional intensity that often characterized drug-influenced literature. This specialization created a perverse form of artistic management, where dealers became almost like talent agents, except their goal was to maintain their clients' addiction rather than advance their careers. They would provide just enough support to keep women productive while ensuring they remained dependent. It was a business model that required extraordinary cruelty disguised as patronage. The psychological manipulation involved in these relationships was incredibly sophisticated. Dealers learned to present themselves as the only people who truly understood their clients' artistic needs. They would claim that conventional society wanted to suppress these women's creativity, that drugs were necessary for accessing their authentic artistic voice, that anyone who encouraged them to quit was really trying to control or diminish their talents. This narrative was particularly effective because it played into the existing bohemian ideology about artistic authenticity and rebellion against bourgeois values. Women who might have been suspicious of obvious criminal manipulation were vulnerable to arguments that framed drug use as artistic necessity and recovery as artistic betrayal. The impact on creative output during this period reveals the complex relationship between consciousness and creativity that these women were unknowingly exploring. In the early stages of addiction, many women did experience enhanced creative periods where their inhibitions were reduced and their willingness to explore difficult emotional territory was increased. Some of the most powerful artistic works from this era were created during these brief windows of drug-enhanced creativity, but these creative bursts were inevitably followed by longer periods of diminished capacity as tolerance built, and withdrawal symptoms began interfering with the ability to work consistently. Women would chase the memory of those early creative highs, using increasing amounts of drugs in an attempt to recapture the artistic inspiration they had initially experienced. The tragedy was that the same neurological processes that made these women brilliant artists also made them particularly vulnerable to addiction. The creative mind's ability to make novel connections between disparate ideas, to think outside conventional patterns, to access and process complex emotions, all of these capabilities that fueled artistic genius also created brain chemistry that was especially susceptible to the artificial enhancement that heroin provided. Neuroscience wouldn't develop the tools to understand these connections for decades, but the women living through this epidemic were conducting an inadvertent experiment in the relationship between brain chemistry and creativity. The results of that experiment were written in destroyed lives and lost artistic potential rather than in scientific journals, but the lessons were no less real for being unrecorded. The international art world was beginning to take notice of what was happening in Paris, but the response was often counterproductive. Collectors and museums began seeking out work by artists who were known to be struggling with addiction, believing that their suffering added authenticity and emotional weight to their creations. This created market incentives that actually encouraged continued drug use by making addiction financially rewarding for artists. Gallery owners in New York, London, and Berlin began advertising exhibitions of authentic Parisian Bohemian art, often specifically mentioning the tragic circumstances of the artists' lives as selling points. This commercialization of human suffering created a global market for what was essentially tragedy porn disguised as artistic appreciation. Some critics began developing elaborate theoretical frameworks for understanding drug-influenced art, treating addiction as though it were an artistic movement rather than a medical condition. They wrote lengthy analyses of how heroin affected color perception, emotional expression, and symbolic content in visual art, completely ignoring the human cost of the phenomena they were studying with such academic detachment. This intellectualization of addiction had devastating effects on the women actually living through it. They began to see their suffering as artistically meaningful rather than medically treatable, which made recovery seem like a betrayal of their artistic identity. The art world's fascination with their tragedy became another barrier to seeking help, another reason to continue using drugs even as their lives disintegrated. The fashion industry's influence on this dynamic was particularly insidious. Designers began creating collections inspired by the aesthetic of drug-using artists, celebrating the extreme thinness, pale complexion, and dramatic eye makeup that were actually symptoms of chronic illness. Fashion magazines published photo spreads that romanticized the bohemian look without acknowledging that they were essentially glamorizing the visible effects of addiction. Young women reading these magazines saw images of models who were styled to look like addicted artists and interpreted this as aspirational rather than cautionary. The fashion industry was literally selling the appearance of drug addiction as desirable, creating cultural pressure for women to achieve a look that was actually indicative of serious medical problems. The beauty industry followed suit, developing cosmetic products designed to help women achieve the pale, gaunt appearance that had become fashionable. Powder compacts promised to create the perfect artistic pallor, while eye makeup was designed to emphasize the dark circles and hollow appearance that characterized chronic drug users. Women were literally painting the symptoms of addiction onto their faces as fashion statements. This cultural appropriation of addiction's visual markers created a disturbing feedback loop where the symptoms of a medical crisis became desirable aesthetic goals. Women who were actually suffering from addiction found their appearance being celebrated and imitated by healthy women who had no understanding of the reality behind the look they were copying. The music industry, which had always been closely connected to bohemian culture, also began reflecting and amplifying the epidemic's influence. Jazz musicians, many of whom were themselves experimenting with drugs, began writing songs that romanticized the bohemian lifestyle without acknowledging its darker aspects. These songs became popular throughout Europe and America, spreading the mythology of drug-enhanced creativity to audiences who had no direct experience with its reality. Nightclub owners began marketing their establishments as places where patrons could experience authentic bohemian atmosphere, often implying that drug use was part of that authenticity. Some clubs actively facilitated drug sales by allowing dealers to operate on their premises or by employing staff members who could connect customers with suppliers. The entertainment industry's romanticization of addiction created a cultural narrative that made recovery seem boring and conventional by comparison. Women struggling with addiction were told, both explicitly and implicitly, that their drug use was what made them interesting, creative, and authentically bohemian. Quitting drugs wasn't just giving up a substance, it was giving up an identity that had been validated and celebrated by the broader culture. The publishing industry's role in perpetuating this mythology was equally problematic. Publishers began actively seeking out memoirs and fiction by addicted women, marketing these works as windows into the authentic bohemian experience. The more tragic and drug-influenced the content, the more marketable it became, creating financial incentives for women to continue using drugs and documenting their deterioration. Literary agents began specializing in representing artists whose personal struggles added commercial appeal to their work. They would actively encourage clients to write about their addiction, their relationships with dealers, their experiences in the drug-using community, treating human tragedy as raw material for profitable publications. Book reviewers developed a vocabulary for praising the raw authenticity and unflinching honesty of drug-influenced writing, often explicitly contrasting it with the sanitized work of writers who hadn't experienced addiction. This critical framework positioned sobriety as artistically limiting and addiction as creatively liberating, making recovery seem like artistic suicide. The educational establishment's response to the epidemic revealed deep confusion about how to balance artistic freedom with student welfare. Art schools were torn between their mission to foster creative expression and their responsibility to protect their students' health and safety. Some institutions developed strict policies prohibiting drug use, while others took a hands-off approach that essentially enabled addiction by treating it as a personal choice that schools had no right to interfere with. The École des Beaux-Arts found itself at the center of this controversy, as increasing numbers of its international students became involved with drugs. Faculty members were divided about whether to report concerning behavior to authorities or families, with some arguing that such intervention violated the principles of artistic freedom that the school was supposed to represent. Some professors began incorporating discussions of drug use into their curricula, not to discourage it, but to explore its potential artistic applications. These academic treatments of addiction often presented drug use as a legitimate artistic technique rather than a dangerous medical condition, giving institutional credibility to practices that were destroying their students' lives and careers. The research community was beginning to take interest in the epidemic, but their approach was often more exploitative than helpful. Psychiatrists and sociologists began studying addicted artists as subjects rather than patients, focusing on the relationship between creativity and drug use while showing little concern for the welfare of the women they were observing. Some researchers gained access to the Bohemian community by presenting themselves as sympathetic observers of artistic culture, then used their position to document addiction's effects without providing any assistance to the women they were studying. Their publications contributed to the academic legitimization of drug use as an artistic practice while offering no practical help to the people suffering from its consequences. Medical researchers were similarly focused on the intellectual puzzle of addiction rather than its human cost. They conducted studies on the physiological effects of heroin without developing effective treatment protocols, treating addicted women as interesting case studies rather than patients deserving compassionate care. The legal system's response to the epidemic was hampered by fundamental disagreements about whether addiction was a criminal or medical matter. Police were arresting women for drug possession, while doctors were debating whether addiction was a disease or a moral failing. This lack of coordination meant that addicted women often found themselves shuttled between criminal justice and medical systems that had contradictory approaches to their condition. Some judges began developing informal protocols for dealing with cases involving addicted artists, recognizing that traditional criminal penalties were ineffective for addressing what appeared to be medical problems. These progressive approaches were often undermined by prosecutors and police officers who insisted that addiction was chosen behavior that deserved punishment rather than treatment. The prison system was completely unprepared to handle the influx of addicted women who were being arrested on drug charges. Most facilities had no medical staff trained in addiction treatment, no protocols for managing withdrawal symptoms, and no programs designed to address the underlying issues that had led to drug use in the first place. Women who were incarcerated for drug-related offenses often emerged from prison in worse condition than when they entered, having been exposed to more dangerous criminal networks while receiving no effective treatment for their addiction. The criminal justice system was inadvertently making the epidemic worse by treating its symptoms punitively rather than addressing its causes medically. The diplomatic implications of the epidemic continued to escalate as more foreign governments became concerned about their citizens who were stranded in Paris by addiction. Some countries began developing repatriation programs specifically for addicted nationals, but these efforts were often frustrated by the women's refusal to cooperate and by French authorities' reluctance to forcibly deport foreign residents. The American embassy began maintaining informal lists of citizens who were known to be struggling with addiction, monitoring their welfare and attempting to facilitate family interventions when possible. But diplomatic staff had no training in addiction counseling and limited authority to intervene in private citizens' lives, making their efforts largely ineffective. International tensions arose when some governments began blaming French authorities for failing to control the drug trade that was affecting their citizens. Diplomatic protests were filed, threatening to damage France's relationships with important allies over what had begun as a local public health problem, but had evolved into an international crisis. The tourism industry, which had been profiting from Paris's reputation as a center of artistic innovation, began grappling with the city's growing association with drug use and moral decay. Travel guides started including warnings about the dangers of the Bohemian districts, while some tour companies began avoiding these areas entirely to protect their clients from potentially troubling encounters. Hotel owners in Montparnasse and Montmartre reported increasing problems with guests who were obviously suffering from drug-related health issues. Some establishments began requiring deposits to cover potential medical expenses or property damage, while others refused to accommodate guests who appeared to be under the influence of drugs. The restaurant and cafe industry faced similar challenges as establishments that had once been proud to serve the artistic community began viewing their bohemian clientele as potential liabilities. Business owners worried about police raids, customer complaints, and the impact on their reputations of being associated with drug use. Some establishments began developing policies to exclude obviously impaired customers, while others embraced their role as gathering places for the artistic community, regardless of the associated problems. This created a two-tiered hospitality industry, where some businesses catered to conventional tourists, while others specialized in serving the needs of the drug-using bohemian community. The transportation industry also found itself dealing with the epidemic's consequences as railways and steamship companies reported increasing numbers of passengers who were obviously suffering from withdrawal symptoms during their journeys. Staff members had no training in handling medical emergencies related to drug addiction, leading to dangerous situations when passengers became seriously ill while traveling. Some transportation companies began requiring medical certificates for passengers who appeared to be in poor health, while others developed protocols for handling drug-related medical emergencies during transit. These policies often discriminated against women whose appearance suggested possible drug use, creating additional barriers for those seeking to leave Paris and recover from their addiction. The epidemic's impact on the broader economy of the artistic districts was becoming increasingly apparent as businesses that had depended on the bohemian community's patronage began struggling financially. Art supply stores reported declining sales as fewer artists were able to afford materials. Galleries saw decreased foot traffic as the artistic community became more focused on obtaining drugs than on cultural activities. The real estate market in bohemian neighborhoods began reflecting the area's declining reputation as property values dropped and respectable tenants sought housing elsewhere. Landlords found themselves dealing with tenants who were unable to pay rent consistently, who caused property damage, and who attracted unwanted attention from police and criminals. Local residents who were not part of the artistic community began organizing to pressure authorities to address what they saw as the deteriorating quality of life in their neighborhoods. They complained about increased crime, visible drug use, and the general atmosphere of decay that had replaced the vibrant cultural activity that had once characterized these areas. The epidemic was systematically destroying the economic and social infrastructure that had made Paris's bohemian districts possible in the first place. The very success of the artistic community had attracted criminal elements that were now consuming it from within, creating a downward spiral that seemed impossible to reverse. As 1930 approached, the heroin epidemic had fundamentally altered not just individual lives, but entire neighborhoods, industries, and cultural institutions. What had begun as a story about personal choice and artistic freedom had evolved into a complex web of exploitation, international crime, and social destruction that touched virtually every aspect of Parisian society. The women at the center of this crisis had become symbols rather than individuals, their personal tragedies subsumed into larger narratives about art, freedom, modernity, and moral decay. Their voices were increasingly absent from discussions about their own lives, as addiction rendered them unable to advocate for themselves, and as society found it easier to debate abstract principles than to confront the human cost of its failures. The bohemian dream that had drawn so many talented women to Paris was dying, killed not by external oppression, but by internal contradictions that no one had anticipated or prepared for. The freedom that had seemed so liberating had become a trap. The creativity that had seemed so authentic had become a commodity. And the community that had seemed so supportive had become a marketplace for human suffering. The epidemic had revealed fundamental flaws in the bohemian ideology that celebrated individual freedom while rejecting social responsibility, that praised authentic expression while ignoring practical consequences, that demanded liberation from conventional morality without developing alternative frameworks for protecting vulnerable community members. These lessons would eventually influence how future generations approach the relationship between artistic freedom and social support, but they came at an enormous cost in human talent and potential. The women who paid that cost with their lives and careers had become unwitting pioneers in understanding the complex relationship between creativity, consciousness, and community responsibility. Their sacrifice would echo through decades of artistic and social development, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of liberation without protection, freedom without boundaries, and creativity without care. The heroin epidemic of the 1920s Paris had become a defining moment in the ongoing struggle to balance individual expression with collective welfare, artistic authenticity with human survival, and revolutionary change with practical wisdom. The story was far from over, but already its impact was spreading beyond Paris, beyond the artistic community, beyond the 1920s themselves, creating ripple effects that would influence how societies around the world understood addiction, creativity, gender roles, and the complex relationship between personal freedom and social responsibility for generations to come. The winter of 1930 brought a different kind of cold to the streets of Montparnasse. It wasn't just the bitter February wind that made people pull their coats tighter as they hurried past the cafes that had once been the heart of Bohemian Paris. There was something else in the air now. Something that made even long-time residents avoid eye contact with the hollow-eyed women who still gathered in doorways and shadowed corners. Marie-Claire Dubois had been documenting this transformation through her camera lens for months, though she wasn't sure anyone would ever want to see the photographs she was taking. As one of the few women in the artistic community who had managed to avoid the epidemic's grip, she had become an accidental historian of its devastation. Her images told a story that no one wanted to acknowledge, but that everyone could see if they looked closely enough. The photograph she took on February 15, 1930, would later become one of the most haunting documents of the entire epidemic. It showed a group of women sitting outside Café de Flore, their faces turned toward the weak winter sun. At first glance, it looked like any other gathering of bohemian artists taking a break from their work. But Marie-Claire's trained eye had captured something more disturbing in their expressions, a vacant quality that spoke of minds no longer fully present in their own bodies. These women had once been the stars of the Montparnasse scene. Sylvie Moreau, the painter in the center of the photograph, had been featured in Vogue just 2 years earlier as one of the most promising young artists in Paris. Her canvases had sold to collectors across Europe, and critics had praised her innovative use of color and her ability to capture the psychological complexity of her subjects. Now Sylvie sat motionless in the winter sunlight, her once expressive hands folded limply in her lap. The painting supplies that had been her constant companions were nowhere to be seen. When Marie-Claire approached her after taking the photograph, Sylvie looked up with eyes that seemed to focus somewhere beyond the present moment. "I'm working on something revolutionary," Sylvie said, her voice carrying the same enthusiasm that had once accompanied announcements of genuine artistic breakthroughs. "It's going to change everything people think they know about color theory." But Marie-Claire had been to Sylvie's studio the week before. There were no new canvases, no evidence of recent work. The easel that had once supported ambitious compositions now held a single small canvas with a few random brushstrokes that appeared to have been applied months earlier and never developed further. The gap between Sylvie's perception of her artistic activity and the reality of her complete creative paralysis had become so wide that bridging it seemed impossible. She would spend hours in her studio, convinced she was painting masterpieces, while actually sitting motionless in front of blank canvases. The drug had hijacked not just her ability to create art, but her ability to recognize that she was no longer creating anything at all. This disconnection from reality was becoming increasingly common throughout the artistic community. Women would describe elaborate projects they were working on, discuss complex artistic theories they were developing, make plans for exhibitions and collaborations that existed only in their drug-altered perception. Friends and family members who tried to point out the discrepancy between these grand plans and the absence of any actual work were dismissed as lacking artistic vision or understanding. The cognitive effects of chronic heroin use were creating a parallel reality where addicted women continued to see themselves as productive, successful artists, even as their actual creative output dwindled to nothing. This wasn't simple denial or self-deception. The drug was literally altering their brain chemistry in ways that made accurate self-assessment impossible. Dr. Jean-Baptiste Mercier, who had been quietly studying these effects at the Salpêtrière Hospital, was documenting cognitive changes that wouldn't be fully understood by neuroscience for decades. His patient notes from this period describe women who could discuss artistic techniques with apparent expertise while being unable to execute even the simplest creative tasks. They retained their intellectual knowledge about art while losing the neurological coordination necessary to translate that knowledge into practice. The tragedy was particularly acute for women whose artistic identity had been central to their sense of self. Unlike male artists, who often had other social roles and sources of identity to fall back on, many of these women had built their entire sense of worth around their creative abilities. When addiction destroyed their capacity to create, it didn't just eliminate their careers. It obliterated their understanding of who they were as human beings. Some women began creating elaborate fictional narratives about their ongoing artistic work, developing complex stories about paintings they were completing, books they were writing, performances they were planning. These fantasies became so detailed and internally consistent that the women themselves seemed to believe them completely, living in an alternative reality where they remained productive and successful artists. The art dealers who had once competed for these women's work found themselves in increasingly uncomfortable positions as the gap between reputation and reality became impossible to ignore. Collectors who had invested in particular artists' work watched helplessly as their investments became worthless, not because of changing artistic fashions, but because the artists themselves had become incapable of producing anything new. Some dealers tried to maintain relationships with addicted artists by commissioning work and providing advances, hoping that financial pressure and professional expectations might motivate recovery. But these efforts usually backfired spectacularly, as the women would take the money, promise to deliver work within specific timeframes, then disappear for weeks or months before returning with excuses that became increasingly implausible. Pierre Rosenberg, who had been one of the most successful dealers in the Montparnasse art market, later described this period as watching a slow-motion disaster that he was powerless to prevent. Artists he had worked with for years would come to his gallery with work that showed obvious signs of severe impairment, but they would present these pieces with the same confidence and artistic justification they had once used to discuss their best work. I remember Claudette bringing me a canvas that was essentially blank, except for a few random marks in one corner, Rosenberg recalled years later. She spent 20 minutes explaining the deep philosophical meaning behind the composition, the revolutionary technique she had developed, the way this piece represented the next evolution in her artistic journey. She was completely sincere. She genuinely believed she had created something profound. The disconnect was so complete that addressing it directly was impossible. Pointing out the obvious problems with the work would cause the artist to become defensive and angry, insisting that conventional minds simply couldn't appreciate her innovative approach. Attempting to discuss the underlying addiction would result in accusations of bourgeois moralizing and artistic close-mindedness. Gallery owners found themselves walking an increasingly narrow line between honesty and compassion, between business interests and personal relationships. Some began refusing to see certain artists, claiming to be too busy or out of town when they called. Others continued to meet with them, but stopped buying their work, leading to conversations that became progressively more awkward, as artists couldn't understand why their obviously brilliant new pieces weren't being purchased. The ripple effects of this artistic paralysis extended far beyond the immediate economic impact on individual artists and dealers. The entire cultural ecosystem that had made Paris the center of international artistic innovation was beginning to collapse as the most talented and productive members of the community became unable to contribute meaningfully to the creative dialogue that had driven the city's cultural renaissance. Young artists arriving in Paris with dreams of joining the Bohemian community found themselves entering a world that bore little resemblance to the vibrant creative environment they had expected. Instead of stimulating artistic conversations and collaborative projects, they encountered a community increasingly focused on obtaining and using drugs, where creative discussions had been replaced by the practical logistics of addiction. The mentorship relationships that had been crucial to the development of young artists were particularly affected by the epidemic. Established artists, who might have served as teachers and guides for newcomers, were too impaired to provide meaningful guidance, while those who remained drug-free were often too overwhelmed by the crisis surrounding them to take on additional responsibilities. Art schools throughout Paris reported dramatic changes in the quality and character of their student populations as the most talented local artists became unable to teach, and as international students began choosing other cities for their artistic education. The École des Beaux-Arts, which had been attracting the brightest young artists from around the world, saw applications drop by nearly 40% between 1928 and 1931. The philosophical and theoretical discussions that had been central to Bohemian culture were also suffering as the community's intellectual leaders became cognitively impaired. The salons and informal gatherings where new artistic movements had been born were now dominated by disjointed monologues from addicted artists who had lost the ability to engage in coherent dialogue with their peers. Gertrude Stein, who had been hosting regular gatherings of artists and writers at her salon, began noticing dramatic changes in the quality of conversation as more of her guests became affected by drug use. What had once been stimulating debates about artistic theory and cultural innovation devolved into rambling, incoherent speeches from individuals who seemed unaware that they were no longer making sense. "The saddest thing," Stein later wrote to a friend, "was watching brilliant minds slowly dissolve before your eyes." These women had been capable of the most sophisticated artistic thinking, and suddenly they were struggling to complete simple sentences. But they didn't seem to realize what was happening to them. They would begin elaborate explanations of complex ideas, and then trail off into incomprehensible fragments, apparently unaware that their thoughts were no longer forming coherent patterns. The impact on artistic movements that were still in their developmental stages was devastating and permanent. Surrealism, which was just beginning to define itself as a distinct movement, lost several women who might have become major figures in its evolution. The movement's emphasis on exploring unconscious mental processes had made it particularly attractive to women experimenting with consciousness-altering drugs, but it also made those women especially vulnerable to addiction. André Breton, the movement's primary theorist, found himself grappling with fundamental questions about the relationship between altered consciousness and authentic artistic expression. Several of the women whose work had been most important to early surrealist exhibitions had become too impaired to continue creating meaningful art, leaving gaps in the movement's development that could never be filled. The Dadaist movement faced similar challenges, as its celebration of chaos and rejection of rational thought made it difficult to distinguish between intentional artistic provocation and the genuine cognitive disorganization that characterized severe addiction. Some of the movement's most radical works from this period were actually created by artists whose apparent artistic innovation was really symptomatic of drug-induced mental impairment. Art historians would later struggle to evaluate works from this period, trying to separate genuine artistic innovation from the products of addiction-altered consciousness. Some pieces that were celebrated as revolutionary at the time were eventually recognized as symptoms of cognitive decline, while others that appeared to be evidence of artistic deterioration were later understood as authentic expressions of the psychological state that addiction creates. The international art world's response to these developments revealed deep confusion about how to evaluate artistic work when the artist's mental state was compromised by drug use. Critics and collectors struggled with questions about authenticity, artistic intention, and the relationship between personal experience and creative expression that had no clear answers. Some critics argued that drug-influenced art was more authentic because it represented unfiltered psychological experience, while others insisted that meaningful art required the kind of conscious control and intentional expression that addiction made impossible. These debates often became heated philosophical arguments that revealed more about the critics' own assumptions than about the artistic merit of the work they were discussing. Museums faced practical dilemmas about how to exhibit and contextualize work created by addicted artists. Should they include information about the artist's drug use in exhibition materials? Should they present such work as examples of authentic artistic expression or as historical documents of a social crisis? Should they continue to acquire and display work that might have been created by artists who were not mentally competent to make informed decisions about their artistic legacy? The commercial art market developed its own complex relationship with addiction-influenced work. Some collectors specifically sought out pieces created by addicted artists, believing that the extremity of the artist's experience gave their work special emotional power and historical significance. Others avoided such work entirely, viewing it as tainted by circumstances that compromised its artistic integrity. Auction houses began developing policies about how to describe and market work by artists whose addiction was publicly known. Some emphasized the tragic circumstances of the artist's life as a way to increase the emotional impact and commercial value of their work. Others tried to focus purely on formal artistic qualities, while avoiding discussion of the personal circumstances that had influenced the work's creation. These commercial decisions had profound effects on how addiction-influenced art was perceived and valued by future generations. Works that were marketed as examples of authentic artistic suffering commanded higher prices than similar pieces by non-addicted artists, creating economic incentives that romanticized addiction and encouraged the view that substance abuse was somehow connected to artistic authenticity. The insurance industry began grappling with complex questions about the value and insurability of work created by artists whose mental capacity was compromised by drug use. Could contracts signed by severely addicted artists be considered legally binding? Were works created during periods of obvious impairment as valuable as pieces from earlier periods when the artist was functioning normally? How should insurance companies assess the risk of insuring collections that included work by artists whose judgment and decision-making capacity were questionable? These legal and financial questions reflected broader social confusion about how to understand and respond to addiction's impact on creative individuals. Society wanted to celebrate artistic genius while condemning self-destructive behavior, to honor creative achievement while acknowledging the human cost of the circumstances that sometimes produced it. The medical profession's understanding of addiction was evolving slowly, but treatment options remained limited and largely ineffective. Most doctors still viewed drug dependency primarily as a moral failing rather than a medical condition, which meant that women seeking help were more likely to encounter judgment than effective care. Dr. Henry Mondor, working at the Hôpital Saint-Antoine, had begun developing what would later be recognized as some of the first medically based approaches to addiction treatment. His case studies from this period document the complex interaction between physical dependency, psychological trauma, and social circumstances that characterize severe heroin addiction. Mondor's observations were revolutionary for their time because he treated addicted women as patients deserving medical care rather than as moral failures requiring punishment. His notes reveal a sophisticated understanding of addiction as a disease process that affected brain chemistry, emotional regulation, and social functioning in ways that made recovery extremely difficult without professional support. The tragedy of these cases, Mondor wrote in 1930, is not that these women lack moral character, but that they are suffering from a medical condition that impairs their ability to make rational decisions about their own welfare. Treating addiction as a moral problem rather than a medical one ensures that patients will continue to suffer and that the underlying disease process will remain untreated. Despite his progressive approach, Mondor's treatment options were severely limited by the medical knowledge and pharmaceutical resources available at the time. He could offer supportive care during withdrawal, nutritional support to address the malnutrition that often accompanied chronic drug use, and treatment for the various infections and injuries that resulted from the lifestyle addiction imposed. But he had no effective medications for managing withdrawal symptoms or preventing relapse. Most of Mondor's patients would complete detoxification successfully, only to relapse within days or weeks, of returning to their previous environment. The social and psychological factors that had contributed to their initial drug use remained unchanged, and they had no tools for managing the cravings and emotional difficulties that made continued sobriety so challenging. The few women who did manage to achieve sustained recovery often did so by leaving Paris entirely, cutting all ties with the artistic community that had been central to their identity. This geographic solution worked for some, but it came at an enormous personal cost, as recovery meant abandoning not just drugs, but also friendships, romantic relationships, career opportunities, and the entire social world that had given their lives meaning. Margot Williams, the painter from Chicago who had made several failed attempts to return home, finally achieved sobriety in 1931 by accepting her family's offer to pay for treatment at a private facility in Switzerland. The treatment itself was relatively primitive, consisting mainly of supervised withdrawal, followed by several months of rest and nutritional rehabilitation. But the distance from Paris and the complete break from her previous social environment allowed her to begin rebuilding her life without constant exposure to drugs and the people who use them. Williams later described her recovery as requiring her to become a completely different person. "I couldn't just stop using drugs," she wrote years later. "I had to stop being the person who used drugs. That meant giving up everything that had made me feel like myself. My friends, my artistic community, my sense of identity as a bohemian rebel. I had to learn how to be creative without chaos, how to be authentic without self-destruction, how to be free without being reckless." The process of rebuilding an artistic identity without drugs proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of recovery for women whose addiction had become intertwined with their creative work. Many had begun using heroin specifically to enhance their artistic abilities, and they had difficulty imagining how they could continue creating meaningful art without chemical assistance. Some women found that their artistic style changed dramatically after recovery, becoming less emotionally intense but more technically accomplished. Others discovered that their creative interests had shifted entirely, leading them to explore new artistic mediums or to pursue careers outside the arts altogether. A few found that they could no longer create art at all, as though the neurological pathways that had connected their emotions to their creative expression had been permanently damaged by their drug use. The psychological challenge of recovery was compounded by the stigma that surrounded both addiction and mental health treatment in the early 1930s. Women who sought help for their drug problems were often viewed as morally compromised individuals who had brought their problems on themselves. Those who achieved recovery faced ongoing suspicion and social rejection from people who assumed that addiction was a permanent character flaw rather than a treatable medical condition. Professional opportunities were particularly limited for women with known histories of drug use. Galleries were reluctant to represent artists whose reliability had been compromised by addiction, even if they had been successfully treated. Publishers avoided working with writers who had previous drug problems, fearing that their addiction might recur and interfere with their ability to meet deadlines and professional obligations. This employment discrimination created additional barriers to recovery by making it difficult for women to rebuild their careers and achieve the financial stability that was often crucial for maintaining sobriety. Many recovered addicts found themselves trapped in a cycle where they couldn't get work because of their addiction history, but they couldn't maintain their recovery without the sense of purpose and financial security that meaningful work provided. The social isolation that accompanied recovery was equally challenging. The Bohemian community had little experience dealing with members who chose sobriety, and many women found that their old friends and colleagues no longer knew how to relate to them once they stopped using drugs. Conversations that had once flowed naturally became awkward and stilted, as the shared experience of drug use had been central to many relationships within the artistic community. Some recovered women attempted to maintain their connections to the bohemian world while avoiding drug use. But this proved extremely difficult, as social gatherings almost inevitably involved drugs, and as the presence of sober individuals made other community members uncomfortable about their own drug use. Many found that they had to choose between their recovery and their social relationships, a choice that often felt like choosing between their health and their identity. The families of women who achieved recovery faced their own complex challenges as they tried to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by years of addiction-related trauma. Parents and siblings often struggled with lingering resentment about the pain and financial burden that their loved one's addiction had caused, even as they were grateful for her recovery. Trust had to be rebuilt gradually, and many families found this process more difficult than they had anticipated. Even women who had been sober for months or years faced ongoing suspicion from family members who had been traumatized by previous relapses and broken promises. The recovery process required emotional healing for entire families, not just for the individuals who had been directly addicted. The children of addicted women faced particularly complex challenges as they tried to understand what had happened to their mothers and how to process their own experiences of neglect, abandonment, and trauma. Many of these children had been sent to live with relatives or placed in institutions during the worst periods of their mother's addiction, creating additional layers of family disruption that persisted long after recovery began. Some children found it difficult to bond with mothers who had been absent or unreliable during crucial developmental years. Others struggled with anger and resentment that complicated their ability to celebrate their mother's recovery. The intergenerational impact of the epidemic created family trauma that would affect multiple generations, as children who had grown up with addicted parents often struggled with their own relationships and parenting abilities years later. The economic impact of the epidemic extended far beyond the immediate costs of drugs and medical treatment. Families had often exhausted their financial resources trying to help addicted daughters, paying for multiple treatment attempts, legal fees, and ongoing support for women who were unable to work consistently. The long-term financial consequences affected siblings' educational opportunities, parents' retirement security, and extended family relationships. Some families had gone into debt to pay for treatment or to support addicted relatives, creating financial stress that persisted for years after recovery began. Others had made sacrifices such as selling property or taking additional jobs to generate resources for addiction-related expenses. The economic burden of addiction often fell disproportionately on female family members, who were expected to provide emotional and financial support regardless of their own circumstances. Insurance companies during this period provided virtually no coverage for addiction treatment, viewing drug dependency as a moral rather than medical problem. Families were responsible for all treatment costs, which were often substantial and which had no guarantee of success. The financial risk of pursuing treatment was enormous, but the human cost of not seeking help was even greater. The lack of insurance coverage also meant that treatment quality varied dramatically based on families' ability to pay. Wealthy families could afford private facilities with medical supervision and comprehensive care, while working-class families often had to rely on charity organizations or public institutions that provided minimal services. This economic inequality in treatment access meant that recovery rates were closely correlated with social class, adding another layer of injustice to an already tragic situation. The religious community's response to the epidemic revealed deep theological divisions about the nature of addiction and the appropriate response to human suffering. Some clergy members viewed drug use as sinful behavior that required repentance and moral reform, while others recognized it as an illness that deserved compassionate care rather than moral judgment. Catholic institutions in Paris found themselves overwhelmed by requests for help from families dealing with addiction, but most religious facilities were unprepared to provide the medical care that severe drug dependency required. Some convents and monasteries developed informal programs for helping addicted women, but these were often based more on prayer and moral guidance than on medical understanding of addiction as a disease process. The Salvation Army and other charitable organizations tried to fill the gap left by inadequate medical and social services, but their resources were limited, and their approach was often moralistic rather than therapeutic. Many charitable programs required religious conversion or moral reform as conditions for receiving help, creating barriers for women who were struggling with addiction, but who were not interested in religious solutions to their problems. Some progressive religious leaders began developing new theological frameworks for understanding addiction that emphasized compassion and healing rather than judgment and punishment. These approaches were controversial within their own religious communities, but they provided important spiritual support for women who were trying to recover while maintaining their religious beliefs. The Protestant churches were generally more accepting of medical approaches to addiction treatment, but they also struggled with questions about how to balance individual responsibility with compassionate care. Some denominations developed specific ministries for helping people affected by addiction, while others maintained that drug use was fundamentally a moral problem that required spiritual rather than medical solutions. The Jewish community in Paris, which included many artists and intellectuals, was particularly affected by the epidemic as several prominent Jewish women became addicted to heroin. The community's response reflected broader Jewish values about education, family responsibility, and social justice. But it also revealed tensions between traditional religious teachings and modern medical understanding of addiction. Some Jewish families hired private physicians and sent addicted daughters to expensive treatment facilities, viewing recovery as a family obligation that justified significant financial sacrifice. Others relied on community support networks and religious guidance to help their loved ones overcome addiction. The diversity of responses within the Jewish community reflected broader social confusion about how to understand and address drug dependency. The intellectual community's response to the epidemic was particularly complex, because many of its members had initially celebrated drug use as a form of artistic and philosophical exploration. Writers, critics, and theorists who had romanticized consciousness-altering substances as tools for accessing higher forms of creativity and understanding were forced to confront the reality that these same substances were destroying the minds they had claimed to enhance. Some intellectuals began developing new philosophical frameworks for understanding the relationship between consciousness, creativity, and self-destruction. These theoretical discussions often became heated debates about the nature of authentic experience, the relationship between suffering and art, and the moral implications of choosing personal expression over social responsibility. The Surrealist movement was particularly affected by these philosophical challenges, as its emphasis on unconscious mental processes and rejection of rational thought made it difficult to develop coherent positions about drug use and addiction. Some surrealists argued that addiction was itself a form of artistic exploration that deserved respect and protection, while others recognized that severe drug dependency actually limited rather than expanded consciousness. André Breton found himself trying to articulate a position that honored the movement's commitment to exploring alternative states of consciousness, while acknowledging the destructive reality of addiction. His writings from this period reveal deep ambivalence about the relationship between chemical alteration of consciousness and authentic artistic expression. "We sought to liberate the mind from the constraints of rational thought," Breton wrote in 1932, "but we discovered that some forms of liberation are actually forms of imprisonment. The drugs that promised to expand consciousness ultimately contracted it, creating tunnel vision rather than expanded awareness. We mistook the destruction of rational thought for the liberation of creative potential, when in fact we were witnessing the destruction of the very cognitive abilities that made meaningful creativity possible." The Dadaist movement faced similar philosophical challenges, as its celebration of chaos and rejection of conventional values made it difficult to distinguish between intentional artistic provocation and the genuine disorganization that characterized severe addiction. Some Dadaist works from this period that were celebrated as revolutionary artistic statements were later recognized as products of drug-impaired consciousness, rather than deliberate artistic choices. The feminist implications of the epidemic were beginning to be discussed by a small number of progressive women who recognized that the crisis was disproportionately affecting female artists, and that society's response reflected gender-based assumptions about women's moral character and decision-making capacity. These early feminist analyses would later influence how addiction was understood and treated, but during the epidemic itself, such perspectives were largely marginalized. Some women began organizing informal support networks for each other, recognizing that recovery required not just medical treatment, but also social support from people who understood the specific challenges facing women in the artistic community. These networks were often more effective than formal treatment programs, because they addressed the social isolation and identity issues that were central to many women's addiction experiences. The international women's suffrage movement was also grappling with the implications of the epidemic, as opponents of women's rights used the crisis to argue that female independence inevitably led to moral decay and self-destructive behavior. Suffragettes found themselves having to defend women's capacity for rational decision-making, while acknowledging that many talented women had indeed made choices that had destroyed their lives and careers. These political debates often oversimplified the complex factors. These political debates often missed the fundamental point that addiction was a medical condition rather than evidence of moral weakness. But they revealed how deeply the epidemic had affected public perceptions of women's capabilities and the wisdom of expanding female rights and opportunities. The labor movement was beginning to recognize that addiction affected working women differently than working men, as female addicts often faced additional discrimination and had fewer economic alternatives when their drug use interfered with their employment. Women who worked in factories, shops, or domestic service had less flexibility in their schedules and fewer opportunities to hide their addiction than men in similar positions. Trade unions were starting to develop policies about how to handle members whose work performance was affected by drug use, but these policies often reflected gender biases that assumed women were less capable of overcoming addiction than men. Female union members who sought help for drug problems were sometimes expelled from their organizations, while male members with similar problems were more likely to receive support and second chances. The emerging field of social work was also grappling with the epidemic's implications as professional social workers encountered increasing numbers of families affected by addiction. Most social work training programs provided little or no education about drug dependency, leaving practitioners unprepared to deal with the complex medical, legal, and social issues that addiction created. Some social workers began developing specialized expertise in addiction-related cases, but their efforts were often hampered by lack of resources and by institutional policies that viewed drug use as a moral rather than medical problem. Social service agencies were often required to report drug users to law enforcement rather than providing them with treatment referrals, creating additional barriers to recovery. The child welfare system was particularly challenged by the epidemic, as increasing numbers of children were affected by their parents' addiction. Many children of addicted mothers were placed in institutions or with relatives, but these placements often occurred without adequate assessment of the children's needs or the caregiver's ability to provide appropriate care. Some children were separated from their mothers unnecessarily because social workers assumed that any level of drug use made women unfit parents, while others remained in dangerous situations because the system lacked resources for proper investigation and intervention. The child welfare policies of this period often reflected moral judgments about addiction rather than evidence-based assessments of children's safety and well-being. The educational system was also affected as teachers began encountering children whose academic performance and behavior problems were related to family addiction issues. Most educators had no training in recognizing or responding to the signs of family trauma that often accompanied parental drug use, leading to inappropriate disciplinary actions and missed opportunities for early intervention. Some schools began developing informal support systems for children from troubled families, but these efforts were usually based on individual teachers' compassion rather than systematic institutional policies. The lack of coordination between educational institutions and social services meant that many children's needs went unaddressed, despite being in contact with multiple systems that might have provided help. The publishing industry continued to grapple with ethical questions about how to handle work submitted by obviously impaired writers. Some editors began developing policies about working with addicted authors, but these policies varied widely and were often influenced more by commercial considerations than by concern for the writer's welfare. Literary agents found themselves in particularly difficult positions as they tried to balance their professional obligations to their clients with their personal concerns about their clients' health and well-being. Some agents attempted to intervene in their clients' personal lives, arranging for medical consultations or family interventions, while others maintained strict professional boundaries regardless of their clients' obvious distress. The book review establishment was beginning to develop critical frameworks for evaluating literature that had been influenced by addiction, but these frameworks often romanticized drug use rather than acknowledging its destructive effects. Critics praised the raw authenticity of addiction-influenced writing without considering the human cost of that authenticity or the ethical implications of celebrating work that documented human suffering. Academic institutions were also struggling with questions about how to teach and research addiction-related topics. Medical schools provided virtually no education about drug dependency, leaving future physicians unprepared to diagnose or treat addicted patients. Psychology and sociology programs were beginning to include addiction in their curricula, but the field's understanding of the condition was still primitive. Research into addiction was limited by both lack of funding and social stigma surrounding the topic. Scientists who studied drug dependency often found their work marginalized within their academic institutions, and research subjects were difficult to recruit because of the legal and social risks associated with admitting to drug use. The few researchers who were studying addiction during this period were hampered by limited methodological tools and by ethical constraints that made it difficult to conduct controlled studies of drug effects. Most research consisted of observational studies and case reports that provided valuable clinical information but couldn't establish clear causal relationships or evaluate treatment effectiveness. The pharmaceutical industry was beginning to recognize that addiction represented both a significant public health problem and a potential market opportunity. Some companies began developing medications that were marketed as treatments for drug dependency, but most of these products were based on limited scientific understanding and were often ineffective or even dangerous. The lack of regulatory oversight meant that addiction treatments could be marketed with minimal evidence of safety or effectiveness. Some products actually contained addictive substances themselves, creating additional dependencies in patients who were seeking recovery from their original drug problems. Patent medicine manufacturers were particularly problematic as they marketed dubious addiction cures to desperate families who were willing to try anything to help their loved ones. These products often contained alcohol, opium, or other drugs, and their use sometimes made addiction problems worse rather than better. The emerging psychiatric profession was developing new theories about the psychological factors that contributed to addiction, but these theories were often based more on speculation than on empirical evidence. Freudian analysts interpreted addiction as evidence of unresolved childhood conflicts, while behaviorist psychologists focused on learned patterns of drug-seeking behavior. These different theoretical approaches led to contradictory treatment recommendations and created confusion among patients and families who received conflicting advice from different mental health professionals. The lack of consensus within the psychiatric community made it difficult to develop effective treatment protocols or to train practitioners in evidence-based approaches to addiction treatment. Mental hospitals were increasingly being called upon to provide care for addicted patients, but most psychiatric facilities were designed for treating severe mental illness rather than drug dependency. The institutional environments and treatment approaches that were appropriate for psychotic patients were often counterproductive for addicted individuals who retained their basic cognitive abilities but who were struggling with chemical dependency. The story of Bohemian women during the heroin craze of 1920s, Paris stands as one of history's most devastating examples of how freedom without protection becomes its own form of prison. These weren't just casualties of their own choices. They were pioneers who paid the ultimate price for lessons society is still learning about the complex relationship between liberation and responsibility, creativity and self-destruction. What makes their tragedy so profound is that it was entirely preventable. With different policies, better medical understanding, and social support systems that matched their revolutionary spirit, these brilliant women might have changed the world instead of becoming cautionary tales about the price of unguarded freedom.